I don't have any disclosures, but I did want to just take a moment to thank the CFAR for funding this project. It was funded through a Next Generation grant. So the objective of the study was to estimate and characterize HIV incidence among a cohort of newly diagnosed men who have sex with men and transgender women in Tijuana. Some rationale for the study. Currently, there are no accurate HIV estimates among this population, despite them being the most heavily impacted population by HIV in the region. Most recent estimates show that among men who have sex with men and transgender women, the HIV prevalence is around 20%, and this compares with about 4% that we just heard about among people who inject drugs and 6% among female sex workers. So incident infections are important to target because people in the primary stages of infection are responsible for a disproportionate amount of onward transmission. And also, as we heard from Sunil, it's very difficult to evaluate programs without accurate incident estimates. So this study took place within Tom Patterson's Proyecto Enlaces. And the goal of Enlaces was to compare the effectiveness of different types of recruitment strategies in identifying new HIV diagnoses. So between March and December 2015, they compared partner contact tracing to venue-based sampling. And then in January of 2016, they switched from the partner contact tracing to respondent-driven sampling and compared it to venue-based sampling. And that was due primarily to a low recruitment rate among the partner contact tracing. So this is a population of cisgender males and transgender females who are over the age of 18, and they had to have sex with another cisgender male or transgender woman in the past 4 months. For this particular incidence study, they had to test positive for HIV for the first time at baseline and then be willing to give a sample for confirmatory testing and sign a medical release so that we could measure adherence over time. It's a longitudinal study, but for this analysis, I'm just using data from the baseline. And the sample size goal was 400, and people came in and did a questionnaire, filled out a questionnaire. It was an interviewer-assisted survey, actually, of sociodemographics, HIV risk behaviors, and then also some psychosocial factors were assessed. So to estimate incidence, we ran limiting antigen avidity tests, lag tests, and we determined a recent infection by an optical density of less than or equal to 1.5. And this can let you know whether or not someone was infected in the past 6 months. So all the comparisons here are going to be between those who are recently infected and those who are, I'm going to call them chronic infections, but it just means we know that it's longer than 6 months' time. So in Enlaces, we had 200 people who were newly diagnosed with HIV, and of those I was able to test 195. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a breakdown of recent infection versus chronic infection broken down by the different recruitment types. So first of all, we see overall about 11% of those who were newly diagnosed ended up having recent infections, so it's pretty high. And we didn't see much of a difference between the different recruitment types. And then also, we did a HIV transmission network analysis. So overall, we had 247 different unique poll sequences. We excluded 47 because they were previously diagnosed. And then, unfortunately, there was a bit of a backlog at the lab, so we only ended up with being able to analyze 130 sequences for now, but that will improve in January. And Sanjay Mehta ran this analysis, by the way, and he used Mega to do so. And then we examined well-supported clusters, so greater than 70% bootstrap support with less than 2% genetic distance. And the goal was to see whether or not incident infections clustered together. And then I also just did a really simple logistic regression analysis. Due to the small sample size, this was sort of what we could do for now. But I looked to see if any of the factors that were captured in the questionnaire were associated with being a recent infection. So here's a table of the demographics. So this is both a breakdown of the demographics by recent infection versus chronic infection, and then also an unadjusted logistic regression on the right-hand side. So first we see overall the sample, the median age was about 32. About 90% of the sample were MSM. And we didn't see many differences between chronic and recent infections that were statistically significant, but you can see that there are slightly fewer chronic infections that had greater than a high school education and slightly more chronic infections that were unemployed. We did see a significant difference in the duration of residence in Tijuana. So people who had recent infection lived in Tijuana for almost twice as long as those with chronic infection. And then those with chronic infection were slightly more likely to be homeless or ever incarcerated as well. And there weren't very many differences between sexual orientation. And here's a similar table that just shows the breakdown of the social and behavioral characteristics. So both groups had about the same number of sex partners in the past 4 months, about 3 to 4. There's slightly more chronic infections, used drugs before sex. And then we asked about substance use in the past month. We also asked about substance use ever, but I thought since we're dealing with incident infections, it'd be more relevant to look at the more recent substance use. And we see that those who had recent infection actually used cocaine significantly more. And then they also, those who were recently infected, experienced more sexual abuse. There's no difference in physical abuse, and then we asked about internalized stigma relating to being a man who has sex with men or a transgender woman, and we didn't see any differences in that scale. And then this is a really simple adjusted logistic regression. So I just wanted to adjust for age and recruitment method just in case there were differences there. And we see that living in Tijuana, the longer you live there, the more likely you are to have recent infection. And also cocaine use was associated with being recently infected. So here's the results of the phylogenetic analysis. So we only had 2 incident infections that clustered together. What this might indicate is that the epidemic in Tijuana among this population is more of a slow-growing, steady epidemic than you would see here in the U.S., where you have sort of outbreaks among specific groups or specific clusters. So limitation is clearly the sample size. It's also cross-sectional and self-report data, so we can't say a lot about causality, but I think that there are some interesting implications. So as I talked about, the phylogenetic analysis could indicate the steady increasing epidemic. It could also, identifying incident infections could help us find clusters of people who have uncontrolled virus, so that could be helpful. And then I just wanted to take a moment to thank the Enlaces investigators for allowing me to do this study, and of course the Enlaces staff, participants, and other funding source. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any questions about this talk?
Just one thing to mention to everyone here, that is the IAS is going to be in Mexico City, and this is the kind of a thing to be very interested in, so be sure to, I know you will, put an abstract in there. I was curious about the time. Have you had time, that is years lived in Tijuana? Have you done a scatter plot yet?
No.
To see, you know what I mean? To me, it'd be really interesting, maybe you could do it in a couple of different ways, but simple scatter plot to see if there's some sort of a break, And did you look at deportation is another question Steph just brought up, which is a good one.
I did look at deportations. There weren't any differences between the two groups. Yeah, but the scatter plot would be really interesting to look at.
Thanks, Britt. You probably haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but I was wondering if you had looked into the association between cocaine use and sexual risk behaviors. Is it associated with lower condom use, or is it maybe that they're mixing with people that are more likely to be HIV positive?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that yet. That's a good question. I've looked at cocaine use before sex, and there wasn't a difference between the recent and chronic infections, but I think if I did some sort of an interaction between cocaine use, well, the problem is there aren't very many people in the sample, so the interactions get a little bit messy, but between cocaine use and condomless sex, that would be interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question if there's not any others popping out. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts going into this about whether or not there would be differences in the number of incident infections by the recruitment methods.
Yeah, so before I saw the results, I would have assumed that the RDS would have found more incident infections, just because in an epidemic in the US, that's what you would find, because they're harder to reach, it would be a harder to reach population. But it looks like in this situation, if you go back to the breakdown of the demographics, it looks like the chronic infection people are actually more marginalized. They're more likely to be unemployed and such. So I would think that would, then in that sense, you would think the RDS would capture them more. So, yeah.
You're saying in the RDS you would capture more chronic because they're more marginalized, and that's sort of reaching into more hidden populations.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I'm also wondering if to follow on that would be possibly supported by the people who are using cocaine, maybe are more likely to be out at the bars and the types of venues where participants were recruited. So that might, maybe with a larger sample, you could start to see differences and whether or not these relationships differ by the recruitment method.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But if they're also scattered more, that is, the incident cases, they're not clustering. And maybe when they're not clustering, it doesn't matter which method you use, you're going to find them because they're just unknowns.
That's true.
Possible.
Maybe that's the unique part. We just haven't worked in this location. I mean, that's kind of interesting when you think about India, where there's this contrast. I don't know. It seemed to work that way. But you didn't contrast so much. You didn't do your RDS and application. Yeah.
Only with RDS.
Yeah.
The other samples with the use time location would ended up recruiting more of the visible people as opposed to RDS, where you end up recruiting people who don't traditionally go to venues. So if you look at the previous samples of MSM in India, you see a lot more cotis who are like the predominantly receptive partners, who are more visible or more engaged in programs. Whereas when we use RDS, we ended up reaching a lot more companies with the penetrative partners who don't really go to many of these locations.
And maybe the incident cases, more in one way or the other?
The incident cases are more among the receptive partners than among the other.
But RDS versus?
Yeah, we have to check.
Yeah, if we get a larger sample, or once we get more sequences, it will be interesting to look at some of these things. All right. Well, thank you again.